Before this particular company ever sold a single box of its most famous product to a classroom anywhere, its actual core business was industrial pigment chemistry, red paint for barns, black powder reinforcing the rubber in automobile tires, and a rugged black wax crayon built specifically for stamping shipping crates and barrels. Nothing whatsoever about any of it designed with a child anywhere in mind at the outset. That last product, the industrial marking crayon nobody outside a warehouse ever saw or gave a second thought to, turned out to be the direct technical ancestor of the single most recognized children's product in American history. The one item nearly every American child has held in their own hands before they could even read. This is the story of Binney and Smith, the company that eventually became Crayola, and of how a piece of genuinely hazardous industrial equipment engineered specifically for marking heavy freight quietly became, with a few careful and deliberate chemical adjustments made by the founder's own family, something entirely safe enough to hand directly to a 5-year-old without a second thought. The story starts with Joseph W. Binney, an English immigrant who arrived in the United States around 1860, part of a broader 19th century wave of English craftsmen and industrialists seeking new opportunity in a rapidly industrializing American economy still recovering from civil conflict, and founded the Peekskill Chemical Works in Peekskill, New York in 1864, 2 full years before his own son Edwin was even born into the family business he would one day inherit and dramatically transform. The company's original business had nothing at all to do with color in any decorative or artistic sense whatsoever. It produced hardwood charcoal and a dry black pigment called lamp black, a fine soot-like powder collected from the incomplete combustion of animal fats and other oils, sold primarily as an industrial coloring and reinforcing agent to other manufacturers, rather than as anything an ordinary household consumer would ever purchase directly for their own use. In 1880, the company relocated its operations to New York City, and Edwin Binney joined the family business as a young man still in his early 20s, alongside his cousin, C. Harold Smith, who had been born in London in 1860 and had lived an unusually eventful early life before ever setting foot in America, having spent time as a young man traveling in New Zealand rather than following any conventional path into the family trade straight away, where he reportedly fell in love with a Maori woman and, according to family accounts passed down through later generations of the Binney family, narrowly escaped a genuinely dangerous confrontation with members of her own community before eventually making his way back across the Pacific, and later still, all the way to the United States to finally join his cousin's growing pigment business. In 1885, Joseph Binney retired from active management of the business, and Edwin and Smith formally took over the operation as partners, renaming it Binney and Smith to reflect the new generation now running it. Their early product line stayed squarely within the industrial pigment trade. Their fathers and grandfathers before them had already established over 2 decades of steady operation, a trade with its own long history of supplying industrial pigment products to manufacturers across the region. Red oxide pigment sold as barn paint across rural America, and carbon black, a related but chemically distinct fine black powder produced by burning oil or natural gas under carefully controlled oxygen-limited conditions that prevented complete combustion and left behind a residue of pure, extremely fine carbon particles suspended as an almost impossibly light soot. Carbon black mattered to American industry for reasons that had nothing to do with its color alone. Beyond simply coloring rubber a deep, uniform black, mixing carbon black into raw rubber compound dramatically increased the finished material's resistance to abrasion, tearing, and general wear over time under real-world driving conditions, a property automobile tire manufacturers cared about enormously as the American auto industry began its own explosive early growth around the turn of the century, transforming what had once been mostly a decorative pigment ingredient into a genuine structural component of one of the era's most important, emerging industries. Binney and Smith's early fortunes, in other words, were tied directly to industrial materials, science-serving heavy manufacturing customers with real engineering requirements, about as far removed from a child's art project as an American chemical business of that particular era could reasonably get. Around 1900, the company diversified into a genuinely different market for the very first time in its history. Slate school pencils, manufactured at a mill the company operated in Easton, Pennsylvania, a facility that would go on to anchor the company's core operations for well over a century afterward, long past the point anyone still working there remembered why it had originally been chosen. Working with a North Carolina talc mine operator named John Ketchum, whose steady supply of raw talc turned out to be exactly what the project ultimately needed to succeed, Binney experimented patiently with combining leftover waste slate left over from ordinary pencil production with cement and Ketchum's talc, eventually discovering, through considerable trial and error spread across many failed batches, a formulation that solved a problem every single teacher in the country had simply learned to live with on a daily basis, without ever expecting it could actually be fixed by anyone. Ordinary blackboard chalk of the era crumbled steadily as it wrote across a board, shedding a fine, persistent cloud of dust that coated desks, clothing, and lungs in roughly equal measure across the course of a single ordinary school day, an accepted but genuinely unpleasant fact of daily classroom life that nobody in the trade had previously bothered to engineer a real, lasting solution for, simply assuming it was an unavoidable cost of using chalk at all. Binney's slate cement talc mixture held together far better under the same ordinary writing pressure a teacher's hand applied at the blackboard, producing a chalk that wrote just as legibly while releasing dramatically less of that irritating airborne powder into the classroom air. The company introduced this new dustless chalk under the brand name Anduseptic, and it won a gold medal at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, a genuine mark of technical distinction and considerable public recognition for what was, on its own surface, an almost embarrassingly mundane classroom supply problem that had simply never been properly solved by anyone in the trade, before Binney's own chemists finally took a serious, systematic run at it. The same year the company introduced that dustless chalk, in 1902, it also introduced something considerably less suited to a classroom or anywhere near a child's hands. The Staonal marking crayon, a rugged black wax crayon engineered specifically for stamping shipping crates, wooden barrels, and other heavy industrial freight with legible, weather-resistant markings that needed to survive rough handling, exposure to rain and moisture, and repeated abrasion during long-distance transport by railcar and cargo ship alike. It was built from ordinary paraffin wax, combined with industrial-grade pigments chosen entirely for durability, low cost, and how well the finished mark held up against weeks of harsh weather during transit, rather than for any consideration whatsoever of what might happen if a curious child later chewed on one or rubbed it directly onto bare skin. Since nobody at Binney Smith actually designing an industrial freight marking crayon back in 1902 had any particular reason to think seriously about either possibility at that early point in the company's history, it was around this same general period that Binney Smith's own sales staff started noticing a second, entirely different kind of request, arriving alongside the usual steady orders for dustless chalk. Schools and individual teachers, increasingly aware of just how crude, and in some documented cases genuinely hazardous, the wax crayons already available on the open retail market actually were, many of them built from whatever cheap industrial pigments happened to be sitting around a given small manufacturer's shop floor with little to no regard for a child's safety or well-being, were asking whether Binney Smith might be able to produce something genuinely better and more trustworthy. An affordable, honestly non-toxic wax crayon, built specifically and deliberately for children, rather than simply adapted haphazardly from adult or industrial products that had never been designed with a child's hands in mind in the first place. Edwin Binney, looking carefully at his own company's existing product line for a possible answer, realized the underlying manufacturing chemistry his own company needed was already sitting right there in front of him, quietly proven out on an entirely different customer base. The Staonal marking crayon had already demonstrated, on thousands of shipping crates across the country, that his own chemists knew exactly how to combine paraffin wax with pigment to produce a stable, durable, easily colored wax stick that held its shape and color reliably. What that existing industrial formula still needed was a complete and careful substitution of ingredients, stripping out every single pigment carrying any real toxicity concern whatsoever, and replacing each one with genuinely safe, carefully selected mineral-based colorants, chosen specifically and deliberately for vivid, appealing color, rather than industrial weather resistance and long-term durability alone. While keeping the same basic wax and pigment manufacturing process the company had already fully mastered, making warehouse crates legible from a distance, rather than making children's own drawings colorful and appealing on a piece of paper. Edwin Binney assigned his own chemist to the project directly, and by 1903, they had a formula they considered genuinely safe and consistent enough to sell directly to children, rather than simply to adult industrial customers. Working alongside his wife, Alice Stead Binney, a former school teacher from the Bronx who understood exactly what a working classroom actually needed from first-hand daily experience, rather than second-hand assumption, the company produced its first box of 8 children's crayons that year. Black, brown, blue, red, purple, orange, yellow, and green, sold for a nickel a box, a deliberately modest price point chosen specifically to be genuinely affordable for ordinary working families, rather than positioned as any kind of luxury item reserved only for wealthier households who could afford imported European art supplies. Alice herself came up with the name for the entirely new product line, combining the French word cray, meaning chalk, with a suffix drawn from oléagineux, meaning oily or oil-based, a direct and deliberate reference to the paraffin wax base the crayons were actually built from underneath their bright, appealing surface color. Crayola, a genuinely clever coin name that managed to sound both reassuringly familiar and entirely new at the very same time. Crayola was not, at first, the only crayon brand Binney Smith sold, and it took some real time in the marketplace to become the obvious flagship product line it would eventually be remembered for almost exclusively decades later. The company marketed several other crayon brands simultaneously in its early 20th century catalogs, under names like Cirola, Cirata, Durell, Perma, and Boston. Each apparently aimed at slightly different segments of the broader crayon market the company was still actively feeling out, through ordinary trial and error and direct customer feedback. Genuinely uncertain at the time which specific name, price point, and positioning would ultimately resonate most strongly with teachers, parents, and retailers across the country. Crayola proved, over the following several years of steady sales, to be the name that actually stuck permanently with teachers, parents, and children alike, in a way none of its sibling brands from the same catalog ever managed to replicate, eventually eclipsing every other crayon brand the company had originally launched alongside it in those same early 20th century catalogs, and becoming, in every meaningful sense that mattered to the business, the company's entire public identity going forward for the remainder of its long existence. The product line grew steadily, and by most accounts, required remarkably little formal advertising to sustain that growth decade after decade, an unusual and enviable position for any consumer product company to find itself in across the better part of a century, particularly one competing in a retail category where flashy marketing typically drove most purchasing decisions. According to figures the company has cited about its own product, over the many decades since, the average American child gets through roughly 730 individual crayons by their 10th birthday alone, a genuinely staggering cumulative volume for what amounts to nothing more than a simple stick of colored wax and paraffin. And Crayola became, by that measure alone, one of the most continuously and repeatedly used manufactured products anywhere in the world, without the company ever needing to spend heavily on national advertising campaigns to convince a single parent or teacher to buy it in the first place. Company executives, according to a tradition that reportedly persisted across multiple successive generations of company leadership, would sign official internal correspondence with an actual crayon rather than an ordinary pen, a small, deliberately whimsical ritual, acknowledging exactly what had made the entire business what it eventually became over the course of more than a century. A private company joke that also happened, quite sincerely, to be a genuine statement of corporate identity. The crayon lineup itself was never entirely static across the following century, and its own evolution ended up quietly tracking broader shifts in American culture in ways nobody at the original company could have anticipated back in 1903. The company revised its core crayon assortment several times over the following decades, most notably in 1935, 1949, 1958, and 1990, adding entirely new colors as pigment chemistry itself advanced, and consumer tastes shifted, quietly retiring others that had fallen out of favor with teachers and parents, and occasionally renaming existing ones for reasons that went well beyond simple marketing refreshes or seasonal packaging updates. In 1962, the company quietly renamed its pinkish-tan crayon, originally called Flesh to Peach, instead, a response to the civil rights movement's growing and entirely reasonable insistence that a single crayon color should not be marketed as representing human skin in general, when American skin tones obviously spanned a far wider and more varied range than that one narrow shade could ever hope to capture on its own. In 1999, the company similarly renamed a reddish-brown crayon, originally called Indian Red, a name chosen decades earlier for a natural pigment historically associated with a particular river region in India, rather than any intended reference to Native Americans whatsoever, to chestnut instead, after receiving persistent feedback over the years that the name was nonetheless being widely and reasonably misunderstood by parents and teachers as an ethnic reference regardless of its actual, rather obscure etymological origin in mineral chemistry. These were small, largely unadvertised changes buried inside a product line most adults assumed had stayed frozen in amber since their own childhoods. The exact same colors and the exact same box they remembered from decades earlier. But they represented the same company still quietly listening to its customers, the way Edwin Binney's original Chemists had listened to teachers asking for a safer alternative to industrial marking crayons more than half a century earlier. A habit of paying attention that had apparently outlasted both founders by generations. The company kept its manufacturing operations centered in the Lehigh Valley region of Pennsylvania throughout this entire period, near the original Easton Mill, where the slate and talc chalk experiments had first taken place decades earlier, and it remained privately controlled by descendants and successors of the original Binney and Smith partnership for most of the 20th century, resisting the kind of outside investment or public stock offering that reshaped so many comparable American manufacturers during the same stretch of decades. In 1984, Hallmark Cards, the greeting card company headquartered in Kansas City, acquired Binney and Smith outright, making it a wholly owned subsidiary rather than an independent business for the first time in its own century-long history. A deal that made a certain intuitive corporate sense, given both companies' shared and genuine interest in bringing color, creativity, and everyday emotional connection into ordinary American households through simple, affordable, mass-market products. Though the acquisition left the company's core Pennsylvania manufacturing operations and its Crayola product line essentially untouched in the years immediately following the sale, with Hallmark largely content to let a proven, self-sustaining business keep operating on its own, already well-established terms, rather than imposing sweeping changes from the outside. The final piece of the company's own corporate identity to change came in 2007, when the business formally renamed itself Crayola LLC, retiring the Binney and Smith name entirely after more than a century of continuous use across every product box, every advertisement, and every piece of official company correspondence. In order to align the corporate identity fully and permanently with the brand, nearly every single customer already associated with the company anyway, regardless of whether they had ever heard the founders' actual surnames at all. It was a quieter, considerably less dramatic version of the same kind of transformation several other companies covered elsewhere in this history eventually went through. A firm voluntarily setting aside its own founders' family names, not because an outside buyer had purchased the rights to a more famous trademark out from under the original company, the way that happened in other cases entirely, but because the company itself, still under Hallmark's ownership, made the deliberate decision that its founders' surnames had become considerably less meaningful to the buying public than the product those founders had actually invented back in 1903. Crayola LLC continues to operate today as a wholly owned subsidiary of Hallmark, still headquartered in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, not far from where the original slate pencil mill once stood, still manufacturing crayons at genuine industrial scale using descendants of that same basic wax and pigment process, along with a considerably wider modern product line spanning markers, colored pencils, modeling clay, paints, and even Silly Putty, a completely unrelated novelty product the company eventually acquired and folded into its own catalog, alongside a chain of hands-on Crayola experience attractions built specifically for families to visit and tour together in person, extending the original company's quietly educational mission well past a simple box of wax sticks and into an entire branded destination experience. The actual manufacturing process behind a finished crayon, once Binney's chemists had settled on a safe formula, was itself a genuinely precise piece of industrial chemistry, rather than the simple, almost primitive process many people imagine when they picture a stick of wax. Paraffin wax had to be melted at a carefully controlled temperature and blended with powdered pigment in exact, repeatable proportions, measured out with genuine precision, since even a small variation in pigment concentration between batches could produce a noticeably different, inconsistent shade between two boxes meant to be entirely identical on the shelf. An unacceptable outcome for a company whose entire reputation rested on children being able to reliably ask for red and get the exact same red every single time they opened a new box, year after year, regardless of when or where that particular box happened to be manufactured. The molten wax and pigment mixture was then poured carefully into long metal molds, shaped into rows of individual crayon cavities, allowed to cool and solidify slowly under controlled temperature conditions to avoid trapped air bubbles or uneven hardening that might weaken the finished stick, and finally ejected from the mold, trimmed of any excess material, and wrapped in labeled paper before being sorted by hand and machine alike into boxes by color, an assembly process that scaled up dramatically in both speed and precision over the following century of continuous production, even as the underlying wax and pigment chemistry itself changed remarkably little from Binney's original 1903 formula. There is something genuinely worth sitting with in how completely this particular company's original identity dissolved into the product it happened to invent almost as an afterthought, adapted directly and deliberately from an industrial marking crayon nobody outside a warehouse loading dock ever saw or thought twice about. At the time it was first developed, Joseph Binney built a business coloring things nobody ever looked at twice. Charcoal and lamp black sold by weight to other manufacturers who needed a reliable industrial pigment for their own products, rather than anything decorative or eye-catching in its own right. His son and nephew built on that same underlying chemistry to color barns and reinforce automobile tires for a rapidly motorizing nation, then again to mark shipping crates for rough handling during long-distance transport across a growing continent, and finally, almost as a direct extension of that same industrial formula, with the hazard quietly and deliberately engineered back out of it, to fill a simple cardboard box that would end up in the hands of nearly every American child born for more than a century afterward, most of whom would never once suspect their own crayons descended from a product originally meant for stamping freight, rather than drawing pictures. The company eventually erased its own founders' names to become, officially and completely, simply the name of the product itself, a rare kind of corporate disappearance that happened not through bankruptcy, not through a hostile takeover, and not through an outside party seizing control of a more valuable trademark the way it happened to several other companies covered elsewhere in this history, but through a business quietly deciding, more than a century after two cousins first took over an unglamorous pigment shop from a retiring father who had never imagined any of it, that its own invention had simply outgrown the two men who first built it, and that the honest and overdue thing to do was finally let the corporate name follow where the product itself had already gone, decades earlier, in the minds of everyone who actually bought it.